Ma'am, open this door right now or I'm breaking it down.
Before I do anything, can you tell me why you're here?
We got a call about a disturbance. You need to step outside.
A disturbance? I'm a nurse. I just got home from a double shift. I've been asleep.
Last warning, open the door or you're going to jail.
I'm not opening my door without a...
Naomi Banks was more than just a nurse. She was a lifeline for people on their worst days. At 43 years old, her life was a cycle of long hours and high stakes at one of the busiest hospitals on the West Coast. On this particular Thursday, she had just finished a brutal 16-hour double shift in the intensive care unit. In the ICU, Naomi specialized in critical care, which meant she spent her day keeping people alive when their organs were failing. She was the kind of expert who could manage 5 doctors and teach new students while never missing a beat with a patient. The work was exhausting, both for her body and her mind. She saw things every day that would give most people nightmares: gunshot wounds, terrible car accidents, and families facing deep sadness. As a black woman in emergency medicine, she also had to work twice as hard to make sure people respected her expertise, even though she had 15 years of experience and many certificates on her wall. By the time she finally clocked out, her feet ached and her eyes were heavy with a deep, bone-weary tiredness. When Naomi finally made it home to her small apartment in Capitol Hill, it was already past 9 p.m. The building was usually quiet, filled with people who kept to themselves, which was exactly what she needed after the noise of the hospital. She moved through her nightly routine like a robot. She took a hot shower to wash away the smell of the hospital, ate some leftover pasta, and finally crawled into bed around 9:45 p.m. She fell into that heavy, dreamless sleep that only comes when you are completely worn out. She had no idea that in less than 2 hours, the quiet safety of her home would be shattered. She thought her day of saving lives was over, but she was about to face a different kind of emergency right at her front door. Naomi stood in her dark living room, her breath shallow and quiet. She walked slowly toward the front door, making sure her bare feet didn't make a sound on the floor. She reached out and looked through the small glass peephole to see who was disturbing her peace. On the other side of the door, she saw a man in a full uniform. It was Agent Miller Cross. The view through the lens showed a man who looked ready for a fight. His body language was loud and clear. He stood with his weight shifted forward, leaning toward her door in a way that was meant to scare anyone inside. His face was tight with anger, and he kept one hand resting right next to the weapon on his duty belt. Naomi's years of working in the ER had taught her how to assess a person's mood in a heartbeat, and her gut told her this man was dangerous. Something felt completely wrong to her. Most people would have seen the badge and the gun and opened the door immediately, but Naomi's training made her stop and think. She noticed that he wasn't looking around like an officer on a helpful welfare check. He was staring directly at the door as if he was hunting. She didn't turn the lock. Instead, she stayed behind the safety of the wood and called out, "What's this about? Open this door right now, or I'm breaking it down." Cross shouted back, his voice echoing in the hallway. Naomi didn't let the threat shake her. She kept her voice steady and asked him again what this was all about. Cross claimed that the police had received a call about a disturbance coming from her apartment and that she needed to step outside immediately. Naomi's mind immediately went into a calm, analytical mode. She knew that the disturbance story was impossible. She had been asleep in a completely silent home with no TV, no music, and no guests. A disturbance? "I'm a nurse. I just worked a double shift," she called through the door. "I've been asleep for 2 hours." Instead of listening, Cross became even more aggressive. He didn't care about her explanation or her professional background. He gave her one last warning: open up or you're getting arrested. It was a classic, opening gambit, meant to scare her into giving up her rights, but Cross had no idea he was dealing with someone who knew exactly how to spot a lie. This was the moment where most people would have turned the lock and opened the door. The loud voice of authority, the threat of going to jail, and the sight of the uniform through the peephole are usually enough to make anyone comply. But Naomi wasn't like most people. Her training had taught her that a badge is not a skeleton key, and her gut was screaming that something was wrong. "Officer, I'm not opening my door without knowing what this is about," she said, her voice projecting clearly toward the wood so her phone could hear her. She began to pepper him with the logical questions a real officer would be able to answer. What disturbance? Who called? What apartment number did they report? Instead of giving her the details, Cross met her questions with a cold, heavy silence. He wasn't used to a civilian who knew the law, especially not a woman he expected to be tired and easily frightened. Naomi realized then that this wasn't about a noise complaint, it was about power. She chose to trust her instincts over the uniform, keeping the deadbolt firmly in place while she prepared for the next level of his intimidation. While Cross fumed on the other side of the wood, Naomi entered documentation mode. She knew that in a situation like this, the truth only matters if you can prove it. Her mind moved with the speed of a medic in a trauma bay, checking off the steps needed to protect herself. First, she grabbed her phone and started a voice recording to capture every word and threat. Second, she opened her doorbell camera app. She had installed the system 6 months ago for package deliveries, but now it was her most important defense. On her screen, she saw a crystal-clear, high-definition live feed of Agent Cross standing right outside her door. She watched him through the phone, seeing the angry look on his face and his aggressive stance that the tiny peephole couldn't fully show. Cross had no idea that while he was trying to bully her, his every move was being saved to a digital cloud. Naomi realized that this video was her power, it was a silent witness that would ensure it wasn't just her word against a man with a badge. Naomi knew that having a digital recording was important, but having a living witness was even better. Still standing in the dark of her apartment, she quickly typed out a text message to her neighbor across the hall, an attorney named Ryan. She kept it brief and urgent: "Police at my door. Aggressive claiming disturbance. Call. I was asleep. Recording everything on my doorbell cam. Can you hear this?" Ryan responded almost instantly. "I hear him," he texted back. "He's shouting. My doorbell camera sees him, too. Recording. Be careful." The tension in Naomi's chest loosened just a little bit. She wasn't alone anymore. Ryan wasn't just a neighbor. As a lawyer, he understood exactly how much of a violation of protocol was happening in their hallway. Now, 2 separate cameras were capturing Agent Cross from 2 different angles, and another professional was standing by to help. Naomi took a deep breath, knowing that no matter what Cross tried next, she had a mountain of evidence building up against him. Cross's voice changed then. It became quieter, which was much more frightening than the shouting. It was the sound of a man who had decided to stop talking and start using force. "Ma'am, if you don't open this door in 5 seconds, I'm going to assume you're destroying evidence and I'm coming in," he warned. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't move toward the lock. She knew there was no evidence to destroy because she had done nothing wrong. She stood her ground, her eyes fixed on her phone screen as the countdown began. 5, 4. This was the biggest moment of tension. Cross was leaning into the door, his posture aggressive and his hand ready. Most people would have snapped under the pressure of those 5 seconds, but Naomi used that time to make a tactical decision. She wasn't going to let him break into her home without a fight from the law itself. While he counted, she was already moving her finger toward the emergency call button on her screen. Naomi didn't wait for Cross to reach 0. She pressed the button on her screen and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Naomi spoke in the same calm, clear voice she used when calling for help in a trauma bay. She identified herself and gave her exact address: the Meridian Apartments on East Pine Street, apartment 312. "There is a police officer at my door threatening to break it down," she explained. She told the dispatcher about the fake disturbance claim and how the man refused to give his badge number. "I was asleep. I'm asking him for his identification and he's refusing. Can you verify this call and tell me what's happening?" The pounding on the door suddenly stopped. Cross must have heard her speaking to the emergency operator through the wood. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher sounded confused. "Hold on, ma'am," the voice said. Naomi stayed perfectly still, her phone in one hand and her eyes still watching the doorbell camera feed of the silent, waiting agent. The silence on the phone lasted only 30 seconds, but to Naomi, it felt like hours. Finally, the dispatcher's voice returned, sounding worried. "Ma'am, I'm not showing any disturbance calls to your address tonight," the operator said. Naomi felt a cold chill run down her spine, but she remained focused. The dispatcher then asked her to describe the officer. Naomi looked back at her doorbell camera feed and described the white male in his 30s with an average build in a full uniform. "Ma'am, I'm going to connect you with a supervisor." "Stay on the line," the dispatcher told her. Through the door, Naomi could hear the faint crackle of Cross's radio. He was talking to someone, but his voice was low and muffled. A new, deeper voice came onto Naomi's phone. "This is Sergeant Williams with Seattle PD. Can you tell me what's going on?" Naomi quickly explained everything, the pounding, the threats to break down her door, and the refusal to identify himself. Sergeant Williams's tone became very serious. He told Naomi he was sending units to her location right away and then said something that changed everything. "Miss Banks, Agent Cross is not assigned to your area tonight. He's not supposed to be in Capitol Hill at all. He gave her a strict order, do not open your door for anyone until you see me personally." Naomi watched her phone screen as the power dynamic shifted in an instant. Through the live doorbell feed, she saw Agent Cross's face change when his own radio began to crackle with urgent chatter. He looked uncertain, his aggressive posture suddenly deflating as he realized the supervisor on the other end of the line was calling for his location. The midnight ambush had failed. Realizing he had been caught in a lie and that the 911 dispatcher knew exactly who he was, Cross didn't wait around to explain himself. He turned away from the door and walked rapidly down the hallway, his footsteps fading as he headed toward the stairs. He looked over his shoulder once, his face fully visible in the high-definition light of Naomi's camera, appearing like a man who knew he had just made a career-ending mistake. Naomi stayed on the line with Sergeant Williams, her eyes still glued to the screen until the hallway was empty. Even though the threat was moving away, her heart was still pounding. She had successfully defended her home using nothing but her voice, her phone, and the truth. She watched the lobby camera feed next, seeing Cross exit the building and disappear into the night just minutes before the first blue and red lights began to reflect against the windows of the street below. Within 6 minutes, the frantic energy of the night changed from a threat to a rescue. Naomi watched the lobby camera feed as 3 police cars pulled up to the curb, their lights flashing against the brick walls of the apartment building. She saw Sergeant Williams and 4 other officers enter the lobby and head toward the elevator. Soon, there was a knock on her door. This time, it wasn't the violent pounding of an aggressor, it was professional and firm. "Miss Banks, this is Sergeant Williams," a calm voice called out. "I'm here with 3 other officers. Can you look through your peephole and verify it's us?" Naomi leaned in and saw 4 officers standing in the hallway, their name tags clearly visible. Sergeant Williams held his badge up to the camera so she could see it clearly. With a shaking hand, Naomi finally turned the deadbolt and opened the door. Sergeant Williams was a black man in his 50s with a kind, steady expression. He looked at Naomi, still in her pajamas and clearly exhausted, and his face showed true concern. "Miss Banks, I apologize for what just happened," he said gently. "Can you tell me everything from the beginning?" For the first time that night, Naomi felt she could finally breathe again. She led them into her living room, ready to hand over the evidence that would change everything. The investigation into Agent Miller Cross moved quickly because of the mountain of evidence Naomi and her neighbor provided. While Naomi tried to recover from her sleepless night, Sergeant Williams and his team began digging into Cross's history. What they found was a disturbing and hidden pattern that had been growing in the shadows for months. The department revealed that Cross had actually been under a quiet investigation for half a year. They had received anonymous tips from other women who described a man in a uniform appearing at their doors late at night with the same fake story about a disturbance. These women were often home alone and lived in buildings without doormen, making them feel trapped and terrified. However, without clear photos or video, the police couldn't prove which officer was responsible. Naomi's doorbell camera changed everything. For the first time, investigators had a high-definition recording of Cross's face and his aggressive behavior. Sergeant Williams looked troubled as he explained that Cross was not just a rude agent, he was a predator who had been hunting for victims while he was off duty. Naomi realized with a chill that her decision to keep the door locked hadn't just saved her from a bad night, it had provided the proof needed to stop a serial criminal who had been hiding behind a federal badge. The investigation was handed over to a special unit that handled the most serious crimes. They didn't just look at what happened at Naomi's door, they looked at Cross's entire life. What they found was devastating. It turned out that Cross wasn't just a bad apple, he was a serial predator who had been using his job to commit terrible acts. The unit discovered that at least 3 other women had been assaulted by an officer who used the exact same disturbance call lie. These women had reported the attacks, but they were so traumatized that they couldn't remember the officer's face clearly, and he had been careful to hide his badge number. Because there were no cameras in those hallways, it had been their word against the police departments. Naomi's case was the breakthrough they needed. Because she stayed calm and used her forensic training, she provided the first, concrete evidence that linked Cross to this pattern of behavior. The detectives realized that Naomi's military and medical background had made her the one person Cross couldn't break. She had provided a face and a name for a monster that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Armed with Naomi's crystal-clear doorbell footage, the department obtained a warrant to search Cross's personal life and his work equipment. What they found on his patrol car computer and his personal phone was a digital map of a predator's mind. Cross had been abusing his access to the federal database for at least 3 years, searching for a very specific type of target. He would look for addresses of single women living alone, usually those between their late 20s and early 40s who lived in apartments without doormen or heavy security. His logs showed he had visited dozens of these addresses while he was off duty, often wearing unmarked clothes but always carrying his badge and weapon to force his way inside. It was a cold, calculated system built to exploit the trust people have in a uniform. The evidence became even more horrifying when detectives found hidden recordings on his phone. Cross had been wearing a small camera during some of his late-night visits, recording the moments he assaulted women in their own homes. He kept these as trophies, never expecting that a nurse with forensic training would be the one to turn the cameras back on him. Naomi's decision to stay calm and document the encounter had cracked open a case that was much bigger and darker than anyone had imagined. The trial of Agent Miller Cross became a national symbol for accountability. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy as Naomi sat behind the prosecution table, watching the man who had tried to break down her door. The most powerful moment came when the prosecutor played Naomi's doorbell camera footage on a large screen. The jury watched in silence as Cross's aggressive face and his threatening countdown filled the room. It was impossible for his lawyers to argue against such clear, high-definition evidence. Naomi also took the stand, her voice steady as she described how her forensic training and military background helped her recognize that Cross was not acting like a real officer. Her neighbor Ryan testified as well, providing a second angle of the encounter from his own camera. The evidence from Cross's computer, the list of targets and the horrifying recordings he had taken of other women, made the case undeniable. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before finding Cross guilty on 11 counts, including burglary, stalking, and official misconduct. At the sentencing hearing, the judge spoke directly to Cross, calling his actions a betrayal of the badge. Because he used his federal authority to hunt innocent people, the judge sentenced him to 28 years in prison without the possibility of early release. As Cross was led away in handcuffs, Naomi finally felt the weight of that night lift off her shoulders. Even after the criminal trial ended, Naomi knew her work was not finished. She felt that the police department needed to be held responsible for letting a predator like Cross operate for so long. She filed a federal civil rights lawsuit, not because she wanted money, but because she wanted to force the system to change. Her lawsuit was 68 pages long and full of expert testimony. Naomi's attorney proved that the department had ignored red flags for months. They showed that 3 other women had reported nearly the same story, but the department had done almost nothing to follow up. They also showed that Cross's suspicious database searches should have been caught by his supervisors long before he ever reached Naomi's door. The trial lasted 9 days, and the jury found in Naomi's favor on every single count. They awarded her a large settlement for the trauma she had endured, but the most important part was the judge's order. The Seattle Police Department was forced to implement sweeping reforms. This included a new rule that all officers must use body cameras for every public contact and a system that automatically flags any officer who looks up personal information without a real case reason. Naomi had turned her private nightmare into a public victory for every woman in the city. Naomi Banks did not let the money from the settlement change who she was. She kept only enough to cover her legal fees and the time she had to take off work during the long trial. The rest of the money, over $500,000, she gave away to 3 important groups. She sent a large portion to a center that helps survivors of assault, another portion to legal aid for people who cannot afford a lawyer, and a final part to start a special grant program. This program pays for security systems and doorbell cameras for women living alone in areas where they might feel unsafe. Today, Naomi still works as a lead nurse in the trauma unit, saving lives just as she did before. But now, she has a second calling. She travels to police academies and nursing schools to give talks about her experience. She shows her doorbell camera footage as a powerful lesson on why documentation is power. Her message is always the same: stay calm, ask questions, and trust your instincts. She teaches people that they have the right to protect themselves, even when the person at the door is wearing a uniform. Naomi's neighbor, Ryan, still lives across the hall, and they remain close friends who look out for one another. Because of Naomi's bravery, the entire apartment building now encourages residents to use security cameras to keep the community safe. Meanwhile, Miller Cross remains behind bars, serving a sentence that ensures he will never be able to hunt for victims again. Naomi Banks proved that one person's courage, backed by the truth and a simple camera, can dismantle a predator's power and change the world for the better.